Hello, welcome everybody. We're going to get started now. My name is Makana Kushi. I'm a PhD candidate in American Studies, and I'm also the program coordinator of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative, which is hosting this event. We're located at 67 George and have a lot going on this year. This is our last public program, though, for this semester. Look out on our social media and our website for the spring programming. We've got mini residencies by a couple amazing Native authors and a performer this spring. And feel free to visit our new spaces once again on 67 George. So thanks so much to the Watson Institute for hosting us in your space today, and to Ambassador Harper for your time, to Professor Geri Augusto for moderating, and the rest of the NACI staff, which is sitting over there, for pulling this together. So this is a Q&A style conversation. Make sure to get some food outside if you haven't already, and we want to let you know that this event is being recorded. So now for our speakers. Ambassador Keith Harper, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, is the first Native American to be named a U.S. ambassador, serving as a U.S. permanent representative to the UN Human Rights Council from 2014 to 2017. He represented the plaintiff class of 500,000 individuals and served as a class counsel in the landmark Indian Trust Fund lawsuit Cobell versus Salazar. Ultimately, the case settled for $3.4 billion, which represents the largest settlement of a lawsuit against the U.S. in history. From 2010 to 2014, Ambassador Harper served as commissioner on the President's Commission on White House Fellowships. He also served as a chair for Native American policy in the 2008 Obama for America presidential campaign, and then as a member of the Obama-Biden presidential transition team in the Energy and Environment cluster. Ambassador Harper was previously senior staff attorney and head of the Washington, D.C. office of the Native American Rights Fund. And our moderator, Professor Geri Augusto, is a longtime scholar and former activist at the intersection between politics of knowledge, knowledge practices, creative expression, and struggles for equality and justice in unequal and highly diverse societies and communities. She is the Director of Undergraduate Development Studies, a faculty associate at Brown Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, or the CSSJ, an affiliate at the Africana Studies Department and at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and a former visiting associate professor of international and public affairs and Africana studies. She does a lot. So now a senior fellow in international and public affairs at the Watson, Professor Augusto is currently part of the Institute's Brazil and Africa initiatives, and we're so grateful for her serving on the steering committee for the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative. She's also a visiting African diaspora scholar for the doctoral program in higher education studies at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, and her interests include subjugated knowledge, global Black radicalism, colonial sciences, higher education transformation, science and technology policy, and visual arts. So thank you both so much again. For those who just joined us, this event is being recorded, and Professor Augusto, you can take it away.
Good afternoon to everyone and welcome. And I'm particularly honored to welcome once again our guest, Ambassador Keith Harper. Actually, he's not a guest this year. He belongs to the Watson temporarily for now, but a guest on the premises and on the campus. And it's quite an honor to be able to engage in a conversation with him. To make this conversation as timely and thought-provoking as possible, I actually went to a new technology, you'll laugh, new for me, crowdsourcing. So I asked the NACI office to crowdsource some questions for me from among the Native American and Indigenous students at Brown, and also the staff there, not all of which questions we may get to today, and we have a small and therefore a close group that I think we can get to a lot of your questions. But before we go into questions at all, I wanted to start off with just a bit of reflection on my own part, and then I'll kick off the first question. So one of the reasons why some of us on this campus think that Native American and Indigenous studies is such an important cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary field to implant on Brown's campus beyond the obvious contribution to the study of the indigenous people's history, experience, creative expressions, is this. I'm speaking for myself, but I'm also speaking for many of my colleagues across the campus who've joined us in this. We believe, and we know, I'll say, that these studies of indigenous, Native American and indigenous studies have the possibility to provide optics and analysis and frameworks which are conceptual, not just empirical, not just the facts or the evidence, but concepts and ideas for so many questions that matter to all of us. When I say all of us, I could say humanity globally, or I could just say the United States, or I could say here in Rhode Island or in the city of Providence. But we've had cause to reflect and to understand more and more that this interdisciplinary field not just is the right thing to do, the better way to study a set of people and their history, but it could contribute so many other kinds of ideas and ways of thinking and making sense and making meaning about so many problems. So, for example, I was thinking back over the past couple of years or few years. If I thought back over 10 years, I could say what kinds of works coming from Native American and indigenous scholars and institutions have been influential in the way that I teach or the way that I think or the way that I do research. So I was thinking the longest trail is back to Maori work in changes for me, in changes how knowledge production is done at the tertiary level, to the point where they now have universities that do doctoral programs in that. And just, it's an amazing thing, both in Australia and New Zealand. And those were influential for me in thinking about transformation of higher education. And of course, that seminal work by Linda Tui Wise Smith about decolonizing methodologies. She was writing from an indigenous people standpoint, but I can tell you that that book and that way that she framed what is research is a dirty word, she said, among my people, and how do you reframe and rethink research projects, the influence of that has just gone way beyond somebody who says, okay, I'm Native American or I'm indigenous and I'm interested in this. I thought about others that, where I first came into the field of indigenous studies, and this is not necessarily Native American, was in South Africa. And there, just from, a period of time working with, they call themselves indigenous healers. The literature likes to call them traditional doctors, so we'll call them traditional doctors. But I could see that they're thinking about indigeneity itself and what it meant, the politics of it. And it's not about do you agree with the politics, but thinking about the importance of indigeneity globally, and also thinking about the importance of indigenous knowledge with respect to not just health, because it's often thought of in connection with health and the environment, but also thinking about botany, thinking about botanical knowledge, period, and bioethics and a host of things. Now, to fast forward to more recent teaching at Brown, I was just going back through my syllabi quickly and thinking what were the things that I assigned to students that just exploded in the classroom in terms of discussion. And so at random, I picked up Mohawk Interrupt Us, The Political Life Across the Borders of Settler States, and that's by Audra Simpson. And so you rethink Canada, the United States, and the whole notion of sovereignty and a notion of work and a notion of home by reading Mohawk Interrupt Us. And you can see how those things would affect and could impact a number of studies. Or there's this short essay that is very polemical and causes a lot of discussion in class. It's called Settler Unfreedoms by Shania Cordes, who is both Black or African American and indigenous. Or this one by Kelly Little Hernandez. She's actually a Latinx scholar, but she wrote this book called City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles. She takes it back to the indigenous population of Los Angeles. You would never read that book again without rethinking policing, prison abolition, farming, the whole water question in California. All of this from a book that, purports, that starts in with it's going to be about the indigenous population of California and then everyone else who comes to California. Or the Professor's Deloria, who many books, there are 3 generations of them, I think, by now. But the ones that I've been using for class recently, the work on playing Indian, and how that whole set of essays around playing Indian opens up a question about the American Revolution, about, just many political questions. Or the other, and I can never remember which of the Delorias, but the ecological Indian. and how one has to be wary of teaching and researching where you're looking for the pure, well, we could just call it the good savage, but the ecological Indian. And then finally, more recently, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz has done an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. She calls it revisioning history. And so when you use these scholars and the work and the frameworks and the questions that they raise, you're way across, I don't want to say beyond, because you're always centered in it as a point of departure, but this is probably something bad to say. Are you off the reservation? You can't say that. I won't say that. That's bad. But you're way beyond where people normally try to quarter, or they think that Native American Indigenous Studies coming to the campus and being implanted, what it can do and what it could bring. So with that brief kind of preamble and reflection, I had a first question for you, Ambassador Harper. What might, or what does, or what can an Indigenous concept of rights bring to the whole study of the history, the practice, and the discourses in human rights?
Well, first, it's great to be here. Thanks for moderating here. So, what it brings to mind when you say that is actually I was talking to some of the Native students yesterday, and they were asking about or how to participate in a larger society when you don't necessarily buy into all the rules and ways of that larger society. And it harkened back to a article written by Rob Williams some years ago called "Taking Rights Aggressively." And it was a debate between him and another scholar from the critical legal theory realm. So not critical race theory that everybody's talking about, but critical legal theory. And basically, that theory is that rules, norms, laws are all based to protect the empowered, in essence, when it gets right down to it. And Rob's point in that article was that, whether that's true or not true, because the critical legal scholars were saying, you don't buy into these notions of rights, because rights or any legal construct is just to protect the already empowered. And his response to that is that, for communities like Native communities, they're going to play on the ball field that's existing. And that's because they have specific objectives to achieve for their community. So a good example is the Indian Child Welfare Act. Prior to the enactment of the Indian Child Welfare Act in the 1970s, between on an average, about a third of Native children were adopted out of their communities. So think about any community that around the country, and think about 1 out of every 3 children getting removed from that community, and think about the traumatic impact that would have to that community. So this is happening all over Native communities, and this is after the boarding school experiences where they were forcefully taken to boarding school. So you have just these continuation of this taking away of the most precious resource you have, your children. So the Indian Child Welfare Act was a law passed by a Congress without a single Native person in it. But that's because tribes advocated for it. And what it does is it puts tribes in the center of the decision-making about what happens to their children. And it tries to ensure that before you take Native children away, that that you have to go through an extensive process. And that's because many of those adoptions and removals were just problematic and unnecessary pre-ICWA. So what I think it says is, the way I think a lot of people think about rights is it's a means to achieving specific objectives that will benefit your community. It's not about whether you buy into a system or don't buy into a system. It's about how do you identify the challenges that are being faced, and then make sure that you utilize whatever legal constructs you have to, political constructs that you have to, political institutions that you have to achieve those objectives. So I think that from the way I see it, that's often the way I think Native people in the U.S. think about rights. They think about, okay, we have a community. Let's talk about a different kind of right. The right for self-governance, which is, in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 1. No, I'm sorry, not Article 1, but in there is the right to self-determination. That does not mean secession. That doesn't mean you want to break away and form your own country. Nobody in Indian country is talking about that. What that does mean is that you get to be self-determinative. You get to be self-governing. And you need to make the decisions. You elect tribal leaders, or in some cases appoint tribal leaders, and they make decisions for that community rather than decision makers in Washington or state capitals or what have you. And why is that so important to advance this concept of tribal sovereignty, this concept of self-determination? Because what we've seen is that in the aggregate, tribal communities make better decisions because they're closer to the problems. They can make more culturally sensitive decisions. They can decide how to utilize their resources. And so the push for self-determination isn't about some abstract construct. It's about how do you achieve benefits that are real and tangible for your community.
Does anyone have a kind of question that would follow up on that? We don't have to, you can do it later, but I didn't want to leave someone hanging if you have something you'd really like to ask based on what Ambassador Harper just put forward. If not, you can sit with it for a while. You can sit with your thoughts. Okay. I have crowdsourced questions, so I'll do maybe pose one or two of those, and by then you will have thought about things that you may wish to ask. So the first one is, I rephrased this, and I hope I rephrased it and kept the sense of what it said, but what are ways that you, Ambassador Harper, would encourage our upcoming generations, and this is coming from a Native American Indigenous student, to hold the United States accountable? When we are past the responsibility, what is your advice?
Well, I think that there are many ways to do that. One thing that I think Indian country has done a lot better in the last, say, 20 years is sort of become involved in the larger politics. When I came to Washington, D.C. in the early 90s, the idea that we would have the Secretary of Interior be a Native woman was just not thinkable. It was not imaginable. And that's because we were just so invisible to the rest of the United States. In part, that's because, and in a lot of ways rightly so, many tribal communities were focused inward to build their institutions, to have economic development, to ensure safety in their community, all these real challenges. And we just started recognizing this right to self-determination in the early 70s. So, tribes were increasingly getting powerful in a lot of ways. But starting in about the 90s, I think that there was much more focus to also empowering yourself within the larger body politic. Because I can recall conversations where in the late 90s when we were like, we wish we could get the first solicitor to the Department of Interior, which is great. The head lawyer of the Department of Interior, it would be a good thing to be Native. And the right Native person too, of course. But then today, we have Deb Haaland as Secretary of Interior. And that's because Deb Haaland was a member of Congress, because she was the her and Sharice David's first two Native women to get elected to Congress. And that was possible because, among other things, because of support from tribal communities who want to engage in the larger body politic. So, what I say is I don't know the answer completely to that question, because I don't know what are going to be the arrows in the quiver that are going to work best 10 years from now or 20 years from now. But I think you have to constantly reassess what are the best arrows in the quiver and utilize those arrows in order to achieve your objectives. And those objectives are going to shift over time as well. So I guess where I come out is this generation. One thing I will say about this upcoming generation, and Deb Haaland is a good example of this, but there are many more examples. For many years, I think there were these very specific positions in government that were set aside for Native folks. Basically, the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs was almost always, and since the 60s, has been a Native person. But what we're seeing now today is that the head of the Water Office at the Department of Interior is Native. The head of the Park Service is Native. The head of the Department of Interior is Native. We have at least one confirmed and one about to be confirmed Native judges, Native women judges. So I think the focus should be less on these positions that are set aside and looking to find places where we're generalists, just like anybody else. And whether that's in the national security space or in environmental policy or education or what have you. Because here's the thing. If you're somebody grounded in their Native community, they are going to bring issues to the table that others may not think about. I mean, that's why diversity is so important, right? At the end of the day, diversity, among other things, is important because it changes the nature of the conversation because people come from different experiences. And I think every time I've seen, let me say one other thing on that. So there was a fundamental shift with the election of Barack Obama, among other things, because he appointed, for the first time, a senior Native affairs advisor in the White House. And the first one of that was a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, Kim Teehee. And that meant that if they were within the Domestic Policy Council, whatever the issues they were talking about, language, education, environment, what land use, you had somebody at the table that knew the impact that was going to have on tribal communities. And so then that can fundamentally change the conversation. So what I urge for Native students to do is to explore ways of getting into positions in which your portfolio is not just Indian country, but is wider, because I think your voice in those discussions are super important. And also for non-Native students who are versed in Native American policy to be in those positions too, because they can have a significant impact as well.
Versed in Native American policy is our job. as professors, as researchers, you're preparing students who, or some of us see it this way. Of course, the galvanizing reason for introducing a program of Native American and Indigenous studies starts with Native American communities. But as I think we're seeing eye to eye on that, the ramifications, the possibilities, the import, the impact goes way beyond that. So it goes beyond people. It goes to people who are not Native American, Indigenous, myself, any one of my colleagues. And I think you raise an important point where you say versed in. That's our job.
Yeah.
We've got to think of ways. So how do we and our students become versed in? It becomes more than a curriculum question. It's a research question, too.
I mean, I think there's a couple of different ways. I think, you mentioned something earlier, which is, reading Native scholars, because I think you'll see there that it's just, in some ways, there is, among some of the scholars, there's just a different way of thinking about the world. And understanding that is how you are versed in. I think critical to have Native instructors, right, and also students, because Native students are going to bring that to the table, and that engagement in a classroom that says, oh, well, this is how it happens in our community and why it happens in our community this way. That could be quite different from other communities. So I think it's a full panoply of things, the type of classes you have, the type of literature you are reading, the type of personnel that is both in the teaching and the student body.
Okay. Let me know when you're ready to come in with a question. If not, I'll do one more. I'll, sit with your thoughts. I can see, even behind masks, I can now read eyes pretty well, or the raise of an eyebrow or something like that. I've learned to get those cues. So I can see you're sitting with aspects of what has been said so far, but not quite ready. So this is the value of crowdsourcing. I'll do another. For our current students and future leaders, what advice would you have regarding how they could best serve as allies to Native American and Indigenous peoples of the United States and beyond? I like that, and beyond. Can you think of any specific or ongoing projects or efforts that need widespread support from both Native and non-Native people?
Yeah, I think what I would say is, for me, the most important thing to support, and it's articulated in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. I think it's said 8 or 9 times in that document. And the term that is used is free, prior, and informed consent. So if you're going to have an impact on Native people or their lands, communities, lands, water, what have you, then you must get there free, right? So free meaning not without any kind of pressure, prior, before you take any action. Informed, they know exactly what the project is going to be and what the implications of that project are going to be, and their consent. And the reason, if we look at American history and the interplay with tribal communities, there is almost all the policies that were failed and had severe negative impacts didn't have consent, certainly didn't have prior consent, certainly didn't have free consent, and certainly didn't have informed consent. I mean, you give me an example. So in the latter part of the 19th century, there was a combination of political forces, some in the Pacific, not Pacific, in the northeast of the country, of people, well-intentioned folks who wanted to improve the lives of Native people. And there were others tended to be in the more western parts of the country that wanted to just take Native land, right? Especially in places like Oklahoma, where all the land was reservation land. And these forces combined, and they created a policy called allotment. And what is the end result of allotment? The end result is, of the 140 million acres that tribes and individuals had pre-allotment, they lost 90 million acres through allotment. So between the time of 1887, the Dawes Act, in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act, when the policy was determined to be utterly failed, 90 million acres was lost. So my message there is that if you want to support Indigenous communities, it seems to me that the most important thing to do is to say we support the notion of free, prior, informed consent. That wherever you're going to impact their communities, they get to decide for themselves what is good policy, what is not good policy. Whether or not they want a pipeline that's going to go underneath their water, their sole waterway. They get to decide. Maybe they do. Maybe they're going to make money on it. They're fine with doing it. But you got to get their free, prior, informed consent. And if you support that fundamental notion, then to me, you're supporting Indigenous peoples.
This question of allotment is one also that in a class that I taught, I think it's last spring, it was about development and the ideas that underlie development studies as it sits today. And usually people connect that to, okay, it has to do with imperialism, it has to do with colonization. But that's something that European countries did. So we kind of shifted the ship to look another way and say, no, colonization, this is a settler colony, so colonization happened here too. And how do the ideas that underlay colonization influence the discourse and the practices of development, which is always supposed to be with people who have some kind of lack. So they need to be developed. And a lot of those ideas actually come from what transpired in the United States, other parts of the Americas as well. But in the United States, in the, well, we would say from the giddy up, but let's say from, the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s forward up to World War II, where you get President Truman's pronunciation about underdevelopment, and the whole thing,
Yeah.
development studies, kind of takes off. But to look at the roots of some of these ideas and notions in the United States and in U.S. history.
Yeah.
And one that was very eye-opening and generated a lot of discussion for the students was allotments.
Mm-hmm.
Because you think, okay, allotment, it's parceled out, people have ownership, maybe they'll sell it or whatever. But when we started pushing into the literature and the native understanding about allotments, was it goes back to a different understanding of land, waterways, humans, human beings, and the relationship to nature and human. A whole set of underlying ideas about land and about uses of land that wasn't land is just a resource, to be parceled up or whatever, to be worked or to be mined.
Well, it's also, that is definitely, there's a lot, that's definitely accurate. I would also add this, that, allotment, the underlying thinking of allotment was also based on a fallacy. Because, yes, I think a lot of Native communities didn't have sort of the sense of owned land like in the West. But in almost every Native community, you had settled expectations of who was going to go where. If, my tribe, Cherokee Nation, when we were out in the East, we had towns, and somebody lived here. Yes, the entirety of the land was owned by collectively under U.S. law. But the notion that we didn't have sort of a system where people have you can build a house there and somebody else can build a house there. Native communities, of course, had that, and they were just different land use systems, and it didn't have the same kind of underlying philosophical underpinnings of what property is in under U.S. Anglo-American law. But so the notion that the allotment was based on is that they don't have systems, so we're going to impose a system, was just based on this fallacy. Because all Native communities had systems. Otherwise, how do you even run a society without a system?
For thousands of years.
Yes.
All right, we're ready. Okay.
Of course, I'm first.
Yes. Dr.
Is it
Gould.
on? Nice, okay. So was that not premeditated, though, I'm wondering? Like with DAWs and everything? Well, so, they had thought about that in Massachusetts, obviously, because we had these reservation things imposed on us. So while there was maybe, we'd like to think a lack of intellectual understanding about indigenous systems, was it also not premeditated to a degree?
Well, I do fundamentally believe that they didn't, that decision makers at the time simply did not understand Indian country. I mean, a lot of these folks that were the Friends of the Indian Society in this neck of the woods, that pushed for the Dawes Act, none of them have ever met an Indian or ever been out to the reservations out west. So they were making decisions based on narratives that they had just heard about. And so that's how you have, this idea of kill the Indian to save the man. And allotment was at that same period. Remember, you read a case like United States versus Kagama, or any along those periods. Why does Congress have power over Indians? Because of their very weakness and inability to live in modern society. So these were the built-in ideas about Native people that drove policy. Now, look, I'm also not, very cognizant of the fact that there were other forces that were just wanted to take Indian land. There was that's clear. The historical record on that could not be more clear. But I do think that there were all another group of powerful people that were making decisions based on just fundamental misunderstandings. And what you see is, I think, throughout U.S. history, but certainly has been demonstrated conclusively to be the case in the last 50 years, is that where tribal communities are able to make decisions for themselves, in aggregate, they do far better. And that is not to say they don't make bad decisions. I mean, there's bad decisions made by tribes all the time. What I'm saying is that they're in a better position to make better decisions in the aggregate for their community because they're closer, they understand the issues better, they understand what's going to be more meaningful, rather than somebody far away that doesn't fully understand all of that particular tribal community's needs, desires, opportunities, et cetera. And so, and that's why if you look at where Indian country is today, they're far better off than we were a decade ago. If you look at a decade ago, we're far better off. Not that we don't have continuing and significant challenges, but we're better off 10 years ago than 10 years prior to that. So we have this upward trajectory. And when did it start? It started basically in 1970 because of this fundamental shift in policy. There was another time that it happened, and that was in 1934 with the Indian Reorganization Act. But of course, that ended with termination, starting in the late 40s, but really about 1952. So we vacillated between these two positions of dominant paternalistic decision-making and allowing native communities to decide things for themselves. And what the historical record demonstrates conclusively, in my judgment, is that one is far better than the other. And I think empirically there's not really, you can't really dispute that.
That answer, both the question and the answer raised so many other things. I'll just push into a couple of them. Could you amplify or contextualize these, the period it's very important that we get a different periodization of history because the markers that are given for us, this was pre, this is post, everything stops with World War II, everything starts with World War I, this is when the Declaration of Independence, and so we have a set of punctuation marks in the history of the country. It makes a great deal of difference when we can get other punctuation marks. So you put a punctuation mark that says 1934 and then to 1952. Could you give a bit more contextual background, particularly for those we're not yet all, you said we need to become versed. Some of us are not yet fully versed. So what's happening in 1934? What's happening around 1952 and the termination to explain that? And then 1970, because 1970 is a marker year. Lots of things that are going on in the country.
Yeah.
So could you contextualize?
Yeah. Okay. So I talked about the allotment period before, and that started in the late 1880s. And the notion was you'd allot everything in trust, and then in 25 years it would fall out of trust, and it would be fee land, it could be sold, et cetera. And that's where just massive amounts of native lands, like I said, 90 million acres was lost. So starting in about 1919, a couple of reports earlier than that, but 1919 or so, there started becoming out of Indian country a lot of reports about just how problematic allotment was and how much it was just dispossessing Indians of land. So there started to be some rethinking at that point. And then a very influential report in 1926 came out called the Merriam Report. It was after, I think, 2 years. And the Merriam Report basically demonstrated that allotment across the board was just utterly disastrous. It was impoverishing Indians across the country. There were all kinds of, I'll give you one example of a real misdeed. And it was BIA agency officials working in cahoots with local people in Oklahoma. And what they would do is what's called forced fee patenting. Because you could go into a process and you could be declared competent, because Indians were presumed incompetent in this period. And you could be declared competent, and you were declared competent, your lands went into from trust to fee status, and therefore could be taxed. And so they did this so that they could be taxed, and then they could be taken for failure to pay taxes. And the most horrendous piece of this is that they did this to military personnel that were fighting in World War I. They forced fee patented their lands. They basically said, look, if you're fighting the U.S. military, we're going to not presume you're incompetent anymore. And so we force fee your land. And by the time they came back from fighting for the country, their lands were taken already for taxes. So allotment was just this utter disaster for tribal communities. And so Congress passed, principally driven by a gentleman named Felix Cohen, who was in the solicitor's office in the Department of Interior at the time. They passed the Indian Reorganization Act. And basically the Indian Reorganization Act was the notion that we're going to rebuild, we're going to have a basis to rebuild tribal communities as self-running communities. So it appointed a tribal council, and it stopped allotment too, though. That was the other critical piece. The other piece it did, what it did is it has this provision, Section 5, which says you can take land into trust. The government can take land and put it back into trust status for tribes or individual Indians. And so that really was a turning point. I'm not saying the IRA was perfect. There's challenges with the IRA, but it was a turning point by both ending allotment and then having a basis to reestablish tribal self-governance. And then, to the extent that tribes were considered too small or alternatively and oddly run or too successful, then starting in the late 50s, or sorry, in the early 50s, they started the termination era, which is literally terminating your tribal body as a separate sovereign. And tribes across the country were terminated, especially in California and a number of states. And they were just going to terminate all the tribes over time. And that, again, was determined to be an utterly failed policy. And then in 1970, I think it's 70 or 71, President Nixon changed the policy in a very influential presidential message to Congress, and he inaugurated what we now call the era of self-determination. And then if you look at the laws that are passed throughout the 70s, you got the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which basically allows for block granting of federal funds so that tribes can run the programs themselves. You have the Indian Minerals Development Act. The purpose of the Indian Minerals Development Act is to put tribal interests first rather than the development interests first of non-Indian corporations. You have the Indian Child Welfare Act. So you have a series of laws that, based on this era of self-determination, sets the preconditions for tribes to become successful. And then tribes then take that and take it a step further by first opening bingo halls, high stakes bingo, and then opening casinos, and then that led to the Cabazon case in 85, I think, which is where the Supreme Court basically said, no, of course they have the right to have gaming in their sovereign lands. And then that leads to the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And part of the success is, of course, gaming allowed tribes to have greater resources because, of course, most tribes don't have a substantial tax base like a city or a state does. And therefore, they have to find resources to be self-governing, and gaming permitted them to do that. And so you have this combination of tribes building stronger institutions based on this different view of federal law where the feds are a partner in the self-governance of the tribe, along with bringing additional resources in initially through gaming and now expanding into many, many different areas of development. I mean, my tribe, the Cherokee Nation, has businesses in all 50 states and 12 countries. And a variety of kind of businesses in all kinds of things from IT to construction. And that's true for a number of tribes out there. So, I don't want to sound like all issues are resolved. What I'm suggesting, though, is that we know how to do this now. We know how to make Indian country stronger because we know what works and what doesn't. And that's really important knowledge.
Yes, Micah.
I was wondering, based on the trajectory of your career, how you saw the relationship between federal Indian law and international policy work. If, because federal Indian law is so rooted in a very specific relationship between recognized tribes and the U.S. government. And I remember you saying yesterday in your conversation with Native students, the kind of point of tribal sovereignty is that tribes get to decide. On the other hand, international policy work, which it seems like you got a lot more into later in your career, is so much focused on intervention, it seems like. So I was wondering how you saw the relationship between those two things, if you saw them as really resonant, or like you brought a lot of skills from one to the other, and so on.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. So coming out of law school, I had two interests. One is national security and foreign policy, human rights, and then tribal law and policy, Indian law. And there's not a lot of nexus between those two. There's a little bit with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which in the late 90s I represented the National Congress of American Indians in the negotiations on the pre-final declaration. So where I could do both, I did both, but there wasn't a lot of nexus, so I wasn't able to do it. How do I see them? I think that, one thing I will tell you is that as many, most of my career I've worked to address problems faced by Indian country and try to empower tribal communities. However, I also now see in a far better way the very positive aspects of the relationship here. I mean, I'll give you one example. In 2013, Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. And of course, even then we knew that, because there were studies going back to about 1992 that showed that Native women were more likely to be victims of violent crime than any other racial gender category. I mean, this is from the Department of Justice, so pretty solid statistics. And that had continued for decades. And another interesting fact about that, for all other categories, the vast majority of the perpetrators were intra-racial, so black on black, Latino on Latino, white on white. But for Native people, the majority of the perpetrators were non-Natives. So what's going on there? Well, there's an easy explanation, and that is that tribes cannot prosecute or couldn't prosecute any crimes committed on the reservation if the perpetrator was non-Native, from a case in the 1970s called Allotment. And so so who are you relying on to prosecute? You're relying on state folks, and in some of these areas, they're going to prosecute the local guy who beat up, was violent with a Native woman. Less likely. So that's how you get this large statistic. In 2013, again, Congress passed this bill after a lot of advocacy from tribes and Native people that provided, under certain circumstances, for there to be jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction, over non-Natives who committed certain crimes of Native women. So for the first time, tribes are exercising now criminal jurisdiction over non. That law doesn't go nearly far enough. We can improve it in so many ways. There's another 20 laws that I'd love to get passed. But nowhere else in the world is that law even possible, where a Native community would be given. I remember speaking in New Zealand some years ago, and they were just trying to figure out how to adopt our tribal court structure, because they didn't. I don't know if they do now, but at the time they had no tribal courts, and they were trying to establish them and work with the government to do so. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's important to identify the challenges and the problems and try to address them through policy and through litigation or what have you. But it's also important to take stock of those things that are working and have been successful. Something like the Violence Against Women Act is a demonstration of that success. The appointment of Deb Haaland didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't preordained. It was a lot of advocacy by folks in Indian country to make that happen. That I think is the hopeful lesson of this, especially this last 20 years or so, is that we can, with a lot of hard work and leadership, we can make a fundamental difference, both here and in other places.
Behind you, and then, yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm just wondering if you know if that change in the law in 2013 about prosecuting non-natives on reservations, if it has affected, or how it has affected the rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Yeah, the statistics demonstrate that it has affected it somewhat, not nearly enough, and that's because that solved one of the issues. The other issue is to put it bluntly, it's just in too many places it's ho hum when a Native, and it doesn't always happen on the reservation. I remember they had that thing the woman that was missing in Wyoming and with her fiance.
Yes, the recent case.
Yeah, and it was all over CNN for days and days. And I think that's great. I think it's great to have a lot of attention whenever anyone has violence. But what was so apparent to Native people is that women go missing all the time in Indian country, Native women, and there's not nearly that kind of attention. So it's the disparate treatment that I think was striking.
Disparate treatment and just a different notion of who counts as a human being and who counts as a woman. So,
Yeah.
we feel this tremendous sympathy. Something has happened to a woman, but you don't feel that tremendous sympathy equally for all women. So thousands can disappear or one can disappear. It depends on who, there's a hierarchy. There's a kind of hierarchy of the human that's implicit
Yeah.
or underlying
Yeah.
this.
All right, one more thing I would just add is under the law, it does take some ramp up time too. You got to get approved by the Department of Justice, and so I think over time we will see it be part of the answer.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. I had a question kind of following up on what Makana was saying in terms of, for Native Pacific Islander communities like the Chamorro community in Guam, folks aren't recognized in terms of tribal nation status, and so don't I guess my understanding is they don't fall under federal Indian law, but then they're Indigenous peoples in a U.S. territory, and so folks have kind of been pursuing the United Nations and as forums for pushing for decolonization and self-determination. And I guess the question I had was kind of what role could the United Nations Forum play in terms of pushing the United States to more proactively consider things like tomorrow's self-determination, decolonization for communities like the folks in the Pacific? In particular with the Davis v. Guam case that,
Yeah.
The Supreme Court didn't grant cert, and so Ninth Circuit Court ruling kind of held. So just kind of curious as to what potential opportunities or avenues the United Nations or other kind of international bodies might offer.
Yeah. I mean, to tell you the truth, I I'm skeptical that the UN can be very effective on that. That I think that that's much more likely to be, and I'm not saying this is easy, especially for a territory, because you don't have the presence in Washington and all that. But I think it's going to be a lot easier and effective to utilize domestic political systems, and that's just because for a number of reasons. One reason is the United States is very powerful within the UN system, and the notion that there's going to be a movement to force the U.S. to do something like that, I just think it's unlikely. The other thing I would say is that despite our challenges in the United States with indigenous communities, there's a lot worse practices around the world, and you have entire communities right now getting moved in Brazil from traditional areas, land rights taken away, and that's happening in places like the Philippines, throughout Asia, even countries that have generally a pretty good track record on rights issues generally, like Botswana, for example. They're not very good on indigenous rights issues. So with all of that, and again with the progress I think tribal communities have made here, I think that it's going to be hard to get the UN to focus on the U.S. On that vein. I think one way that it could be helpful, and this, if I were to try to utilize a UN system to do this, I'd probably start with the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples and have them visit Guam or wherever else and do a report on something like that, because they do country visits, and I know they did a U.S. visit, but they didn't. I don't think they went to any of the territories. So that's one place to start, because I think really what you want is some official tools as to why the change needs to happen, and A, what the problem is, and B, how does it change? How does it improve? So I think that, but the UN is just not a very, generally speaking, effective instrument on the more powerful countries.
I could see another side to your question, which doesn't run through the UN, but does run through a set of kind of international or transnational relations and conversations among indigenous communities in different places. I was precisely thinking of Brazil, and well, first of all, just the need for what Ambassador Harper spoke about about an hour or so ago, but I'm stuck with, in my mind, well-versed, and the need to become well-versed. So I was thinking of, there must be a lot of scope for international conversation that's not through the UN, but maybe community to community or organization to organization or political institution, of which, in the United States there may be more, to political institution in other places. I was particularly thinking of Brazil because I do some work in Brazil, and a lot of occasion to compare the Bureau of Indian Affairs and its whole history with the similar body, or that arose, in a similar kind of way. It used to be called FUNAI. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's in Brazil. And precisely this question of land, it would make such interesting cross-national discussion to go through to make people understand the allotment and all the ideas that underlay it, the kind of the markers that Ambassador Harper spoke of, Indian Reorganization Act and so forth, and the ideas that underlie it all, because one of the big struggles for indigenous people in Brazil is to get entitlement to this land. And it's a crazy kind of process of how you get entitlement. It passes through something. I tell people who are studying anthropology, I say, you may think that anthropology has no big power, but in Brazil, for an indigenous group to get the process going, to just say, this is our land, we've been here 10,000 years, we have an entitlement to it. Today in Brazil, you have to have a report by an anthropologist. Sometimes a historian too, but I mean a PhD anthropologist primarily, and a historian, who has to go to the people and they're certifying, do you really exist? Do you really have a culture? I mean, it's a crazy kind of thing. And I often think that across conversation, not necessarily at the level of the UN, because I agree with Ambassador Harper, there are limits. People think the United States is against the UN. No, the United States always has been and continues to be very powerful in the UN. So there's a limit except for the publicity purposes, and I think publicity is always a good thing. You know, there's a political theater purpose to appearing in these bodies and saying something and doing something. It has its effect, but I think there's so much room for cross-conversation, for us learning about, becoming well-versed in the policies that have to do with Native peoples inside all of the Americas, and then the Pacific. The level of, if I may be frank, I'll speak personally, level of ignorance about the Pacific as part of the settler colonial process is very high. And it's quite frankly been, the Maori thing, but also the Native Americans, the Pacifica, with an S and a K and all that, students that I've come across at Brown, who have, who bring a different kind of consciousness about what is going on. And I think that, part of what researchers, students, and professors might do is open up the kind of an international perspective on these questions, including the San from Botswana, because most people would say, well, who are the indigenous people in Southern Africa? But it turns out that there is a history of appropriation of land and dispossession. We need to know more. We need to become well-versed.
Yeah.
We need to know
And
a lot
to
more.
that point, I mean, the other thing that when I say domestic, I think, I think the sort of the Native Hawaiians have done very well of engaging in Washington. The Akaka bill had a majority of votes in the Senate. The reason it didn't pass because of the filibuster. And that's not a cure-all, but it did have it was something that was advocated for. And so, and in part, one of the ways I think the Native Hawaiians were successful is by engaging the rest of Indian country. There's always a Native Hawaiian who serves on the board of the Native American Rights Fund. They're engaged at the National Congress of American Indians. So I would say that for these other territories as well, engaging with the rest of Indian country would be a good first step to kind of tell their story and why they too should be to have the same kind of recognition. I think that they'll find probably support in the community.
Other questions, observations, comments?
I have a question since
Sure.
I have the mic.
You got the mic, you got the power.
This is more of like a very selfish question, and it's more domestic than it is international. But during my course of research with MMIW, with missing murdered Indigenous women and girls, I had noticed a number of task forces growing, especially in the West. Which is where I'm from. I'm originally from New Mexico, and but I couldn't help but notice that there's a task force in New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, all completely around Colorado, but Colorado lacks a task force. And so I was curious about any advice or what you would say, like in terms of trying to get that launched in the state that I hold a responsibility to, in order just to determine whether or not there's a problem, just to kind of get the baseline and the pulse of MMIW in Colorado.
Yeah, I mean, I think where I would start on that is Southern Ute and Ute Mountain Ute, right? The two tribes, because I think that's what, that if they make it a priority, it'll probably happen at some point. The other thing is I think ultimately, and I'm glad these task forces were created. I've read the one about Wind River, the Wyoming one, and it was very effective, I think. But ultimately, in my mind, there has to be a federal level, and they're doing that, right? I mean, Deb Haaland and Attorney General Garland are going to co-chair one on MMIW, because a lot of the resources that are needed to address that are federal resources. whether that's Department of Justice or Department of Interior. And so, and it's really a national problem as well. I mean, you have these issues in the interior West, to be sure, but you also have these issues in the Great Lakes. You have these issues in the Pacific Northwest. They're all over the place, and so we have to have a comprehensive federal approach, I think. And I'm glad that's going to happen. And then we have to see from there what the product is, and then hopefully that will mean a better way of creating policy and more investment in addressing the issue.
Okay. We certainly have time for one more question, if there is one more question or comment. Yes.
I was wondering how your how your position as a Cherokee Nation citizen has informed your career decisions and your work in general so far. Professor Augusto was talking earlier about the different epistemologies that Pacific Island Native students would have in a classroom, but I think it's even more specific than that. Someone from Cherokee Nation would have different a different epistemological standpoint than even someone from another Native nation. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Cherokee people have pursued their rights through legal means for a long time. I mean, it's not a surprise. We had our own written code in 1804. It's no surprise that a lot of the major cases that have gone to the Supreme Court in the early days, 2 out of the 3 Marshall Trilogy, Worcester and Cherokee Nation, are 2 Cherokee cases. And it's always been the case that we've had a culture of pursuing rights through legal means. And, so that's just, I think, part of what you hear about, what you learn about, what you think about. Not that others don't think about pursuing rights, but I think it's fair to say that we've done it for a long time, and that it's something that's part of the culture, really. So it's a natural to think about pursuing that kind of thing for me.
Okay. Going once, going twice. I'll just say it's been a pleasure I'm glad now we had the conversational format rather than the forcing you to give one more talk kind of format. And I'm hoping that we could do this again, maybe in another semester and maybe with other participants, because I have a host of questions, and when you're moderating, you try not to do your whole set of questions, but I would love a conversation. This is like a small conversation, even though it's filmed, because there's so many questions. For example, we could have a whole conversation about African Americans, Native Americans, and looking at the same principles, say self-determination, the understandings and misunderstandings of sovereignty and what that means, the land question and, possession, dispossession, taking possession, but within a system, a legal system that has dispossessed somebody else. I mean, there are many kinds of issues that I think would be important to understand, and to try to do them through I told you this polemical article that my classes have really kind of gone to town on about settler unfreedoms.
Mm-hmm.
And one of her contentions is that we need to be able to look at these questions and open these questions up. She's particularly speaking of African Americans and Native Americans, not through settler logics. In other words, you would use, say, the Cherokee logics, and you would use an African American or Afro-descendant logic, but you wouldn't necessarily look at it through kind of the larger settler colonial framework without parsing it out. That would make a wonderful conversation to have at another time. I think we could return to the international, again. So many things. I think the conversation has illustrated what I tried to argue initially, which was we need Native American and Indigenous studies at Brown. We need it because there are Native American and Indigenous studies, and there are Native American and Indigenous communities. But we also need it because of the knowledge production that it is our duty to do. We also need those other frameworks, those other concepts, those other histories. And I think conversations, besides just the formal talk, I think that conversations bring out the richness and the contentiousness of the possibilities that could come from us implanting it here in the center of the campus and in all the places. I didn't even get to visual sovereignty and how the notions of visual sovereignty have begun to influence how some of us think about art and about museums. That's a whole other category, which goes beyond. In other words, using it as a point of departure. I think that there's so many paths that are interesting and that are important that we could take. And for your being one of our guides in trying to explode this outward and implant it inward, I want to, on behalf of NACI and our conversationalists, thank you.
Good to be here.